Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, you'll learn how to create this responsive card layout using CSS Grid. So to get started on this project, we're going to be jumping into Terminal to create the folder and files that we need for this project. So right now you can see by this little tilde that I'm in my root directory. So if I type ls, which means list, you'll see all the other directories in my root. And I want this project to live on my desktop. So I'll do cd, which is change directory, start typing desktop, and I don't have to type it all. I just type a little bit and I can hit tab to autocomplete and then hit return to go into my desktop. Now, if I type ls again, you'll see these two files here printing, which are the ones that are over here on the right. So let's go ahead and make a new folder by doing make dir or make directory. And we'll go ahead and call this CSS Grid Card Layout. Then we can cd or change directories into that. And now we're going to use the touch command to create two files, one being index.html and the others being styles.css. So if we ls that and list those items, you can see those two printing to the terminal. Then what we can do is use the code command, which is one that comes with Visual Studio Code. And if you're using a Mac, this isn't going to work out of the box. You do have to set something up in Visual Studio Code. But I'll be sure to link that below so you can easily do that. Don't worry, it's super simple. So then we'll hit return, and this will open up a Visual Studio Code project. So let's go ahead and exit out of that welcome screen. I'm going to come down here to the extensions and talk about Live Server, which is what we're going to be using in this course, in order to create a development local server that also has live reload features. So once you have that installed, you just click on this button. Mine says uninstall, yours will say install. We can come back to our project, open up our index.html, and by default, Visual Studio Code has Emmet installed. And Emmet comes with some handy tools to make writing code faster. And one of those is with boilerplates. Now, boilerplate is just really, it's just starter code that, you know, if you're writing an HTML doc that you're going to be writing for most of your HTML docs. And what you can do is you can write exclamation point, and this little command or comment comes up, and you can click here and it inserts some boilerplate. And what you can do is go ahead and just change the title here to something a little more descriptive. And then we need to pull in our style sheet. And next up, we want to pull in the Google font that we're going to be using, which is Open Sans. So I'm going to come into Google here, go to fonts.google.com. Up here, I'm going to type Open Sans. Click here to add that to my selection. Expand this little window. Come into Customize and make sure that we just have regular 400 checked. Come back into Embed. Copy this link here, or this link tag. Come back into my header and then paste that here and then save that. All right, so that's basically everything for the actual heading part of this. We want to come now into the body and start writing our HTML. And the first thing I'm going to do is just create a main tag here. And in here is going to be a section. And this section is going to have a class called cards. And in here we're going to have a new div. And this is going to have a class equal to card. And in here, the first thing we want to do is create another div, and this is going to be the card image container. And what's cool about this container is it's going to essentially act like a mask for the image. Now, you won't see any of this in the HTML part. This is what we're going to be doing in the CSS. But let's go ahead and just continue here and pull in an image. And I'm going to pull this image in right from Unsplash. So let's come into Unsplash here. Type in unsplash.com, search for an image here. I'll just do a mountain. I'll find a mountain image that I like. So this one's nice. I can say open image in new tab. And in this URL, you can see the width here is 1350. So let's go ahead and set that to 1200. And then I'm going to copy this URL, come back into my project, and then paste it here into the source. and then go ahead and close off that image tag. So now that we have some actual content in here, let's go ahead and boot up Live Server so we can see this in real time. So we'll come into index.html, hover over it, and then say open with Live Server. Now it's going to open this in our default browser, but we can copy this URL up here. And I'm actually going to be using Firefox because Firefox has some really nice dev tools for CSS Grid. So let's come up here and then paste that in. And we can just go ahead and just close out of Chrome because we don't need this anymore. And I'm going to come over here and just move this over to the left and then move this code over to the right so we can see both of these items. And then we can click here to collapse that menu and continue writing our code. So after the card image container, we want to create another div. And this div is going to have a class of card content. And in this, we're going to have a p tag, giving this a class of card title, and also passing in a reusable style here called text medium. And we go ahead and write a title here for our card. And underneath this p tag, we're going to create another div. And this div is going to have a class called card info. So this is still in the card content div. And in here, we'll have a p tag, giving this a class of text medium. And this is going to be the length of the class, so 30 minutes. Then let's go ahead and just copy this p tag, paste this below, and we'll keep the text medium, but we actually want to add another class here called card price. And the price on this one, because I'm a generous person, is free. So if we save that, we can see all the content now here in our project. And this is basically everything we need to do in order to start styling this card. So in order to style, we need to come into our styles.css file here. And the first thing I'm going to do is just add some resets. And to do that, we can do asterisk, which applies it to everything. We can first set box sizing to border box. And I've gone over what this is, but just to spare you the details, I will link a really awesome article for you to read over in the details or in the description below so you can learn more about what this is actually doing. But essentially what it's doing is it's making sure that margin and padding are acting like we want them to. So more on that in the description below. But let's go ahead and just set padding and margin to 0. If we save that, you can see everything now is reset. Then we can go ahead and just set a background color here on our body to the following hex code. Next up, we want to go ahead and define the actual grid. And we're going to do that on the main tag. And first, we need to say we want to use grid by saying display grid. And then we'll define grid template columns. And what I'm going to do is the first column is going to have a value of 1FR. Now, FR is a unit that we're able to use in grid, and it's a calculated unit. And let's say, for instance, we wanted 3 equal columns, and these columns are going to have different sizes. So what we could do is 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. So now we would have 3 columns. And let's say, for instance, we wanted this second column to be twice as big. We could do something like 2FR. Now this one is 3 columns, but the one in the middle is twice as big as the 2 on the left and right. So 1FR is a really cool, useful way or unit that we can use in order to write some different sizings here and also just create responsive grids. And these are going to act as like white space for my grid, and in between them is actually going to be the 12 columns that we're going to be using to put our content in. Now, the reason I like to do this is, let's say, for instance, we had a section that we wanted to expand full width. We could easily just tell it to fill up 14 columns instead of the 12. Now, let's go ahead and just create the 12 here that's going to hold most of our content by writing repeat. We want to repeat this 12 times. We want to set a min-max here. And min is going to be set to auto, so this value is going to be calculated, and the max value is going to be 60 pixels. Now let's go ahead and save that and go ahead and set a grid gap here as well. This is just going to be spacing between the columns and rows. So before we move on, I do want to talk about this min-max value again. Now the minimum that this could ever be is auto, and the maximum is 60 pixels. Now where am I getting 60? Well, 60 is a value of the maximum that we want to create. So 12 times 60, let's go ahead and open up our calculator so you can see that a little easier. So 12 times 60 is going to be 720. Now 720 is the max here, but we also have a grid gap. There's 40 pixels between each of these. So 40 times 11 plus that 720 is going to give us a max value of these center 12 columns to 1160. So our content is never going to be bigger than 1160. And that's the reason I like to do it like this, because once we are smaller than 1160, that value is just going to be auto. So the 60 columns for the 60 pixels that are set to the largest column is just going to be calculated by this min-max. All right, so now that we have grid gap set, let's go ahead and just add some padding so it has some breathing room on the top. So I'll do 60 pixels on the top and then a 0 on the left and right. And let's go ahead and now just add that text medium style that we're going to be reusing. And this is going to have a font family of Open Sans with a fall off of sans serif. Go ahead and set the font size here. Line height, font weight, and the color. All right, so now you can see those that text is now changed to Open Sans. This font, the size, the family, the color have all changed because we passed in that text medium. So now let's go ahead and move on to the cards. In the cards, we can define where that should take up. So remember that we created technically 14 columns, and then in the middle we have 12. So what we can do is we can say grid column, and we could do grid column start and also grid column end to do this, but the shorthand is this grid column. And we want this to start on the second row or the second column. So it's not starting on this one. This is going to be the white space, and it's starting at the first column here on our 12. And what we want to do is we want this to span 12 columns. So now you can see that that's shifted over. If we come in and inspect this element, you can see in Firefox, there's this really cool functionality to select the grid, and then you can see the grid all the time once you are off this element. So you can see the 12 columns, and the first column is, this isn't taking it up because we told it to ignore the first column and not start there. We told it to start on the second. And now we still have some work here to do. And one of the things we need to do is actually have display on this as well. Now remember, cards is a child of this main, or yes, the cards is a child of the main. So once we set the grid here, the cards only cares about that. The individual card doesn't care about the grid on main. It cares about what the parent of it wants. So we need to set display grid on here as well. So that's why we do display grid again. And let's go ahead and copy this grid template columns, paste it down here. And on this one, I don't want the 1FR, I just want the 12 columns. So we'll just go ahead and have that there. And you can see if we select this grid, you can see the cards now has 12 columns. Now, it's not, the width isn't correct because we still need to add a grid gap. So let's go ahead and do grid gap and then set that to 40 pixels. So now you can see that is the correct width, which is the same as this one up here, the center 12. Let's go ahead and just select this main one again so we can see that grid. And now that we have grid on our cards parent as well, we can actually define how big we want the individual card to be. So to do that, we do grid column end. And we just want this to span 4 columns. So if we save that, the image isn't going to resize because we still have some work to do on that, but you'll see that these now span 4 columns. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now we can use display flex on this. And if we save that, you'll see now that it's going to move over here because that's the default value with flex. But we can change that by setting flex direction to column. And now it's going to revert back to up and down. And I'm going to do just set a background color here to a hex code. And we also want the cursor to be pointer. So once we hover over this, it changes to the pointer, which indicates that it's clickable. And we also want to add a transition here. And this transition is going to be important for the hover pseudo class, but we're just going to go ahead and apply this to all the things that are changing on our hover. It's going to be a 0.3 second animation. The motion is going to be ease and the delay is going to be 0 seconds. So that's everything for the card. I'm actually going to come back and do the card hover later because right now the card isn't styled correctly. So let's go ahead and just move on to the card image container. And I said earlier that this is going to act essentially like a mask would in like Photoshop or other programs. And it's going to hide the image. And it's also going to be in a specific aspect ratio. Now, if you're not familiar with the idea of an aspect ratio, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of a 1080 video, right? An HD video. And the size of a 1080 video is 1920, so that's the width, and then 1080. And that aspect ratio is 16:9. And we want to recreate that because the video thumbnails that I create are in that ratio size. So first, we need to set the width here to just 100%. So we're saying this container needs to take up 100% of the parent that it's in, which is the card class. And then it has this really cool, people call it a hack, but it's really not a hack. It's legitimate, CSS. And what you can do here is you can set a padding top to a percentage of the aspect ratio. So let's go ahead and just come into the calculator and show you how that's calculated. So if 16:9 or 16/9 aspect ratio, if we first divide 9 divided by 16, and then multiply that by 100, we get 56.25%. So if we go ahead and set that here to 56.25%, this is now going to have an aspect ratio here, if we hover over this, of 16:9. Now, again, we still have to do some stuff and work on the actual image, but there are a few things we need to still do here on our container. And one of them is to add overflow to hidden. And once we save that, you'll see the image is now hidden. Everything that's overflowing of the parent is now hidden, which is going to give us that masking effect. And we also need to set position to relative. And this allows us to set position to absolute on our image. So let's go ahead and move on to our image here. And this is also going to take up 100%. So you can see that has now resized. And we need to set position to absolute. And it disappears because we haven't told it where it needs to go. And the next code that we're going to write is essentially important because it's going to center the image. Now, the reason I'm doing this, now I usually create, like I said, the images always in 16:9, but let's say, for instance, I had an image that, like this image that we're using, is not in 16:9 ratio. What this is going to do is it's going to center it regardless of the aspect ratio. And the way we do this with absolute positioning is first setting a top position to 50%, and also a left position to 50%. And if we save that, you'll see in this card image that the image, like this left side, the left top side, is in the center of that container. And what we can do is use transform to move that over 50% on the X and Y axis. So we'll do transform, translate, and the first value is negative 50%, and the Y value is the same thing, so negative 50%, if I can remember where the percentage sign is. There we go. So if we save that, you'll now see that this is centered in this column, and it's also a 16:9 ratio. So if we come in and actually look at the image, you can see on the top and bottom that there is an equal proportion that overhangs and is hidden from this container. And this is just a really nice flexible way to handle images of different sizes in your design. All right, so that was a lot to cover there in that section, but the rest of it's pretty straightforward. The next part we need to design is the card content. So we'll do card content, and on this, we're just adding some padding all the way around the edges. So this gives a little more breathing room here for our text. And now what we can do is we can move on to the card title. And the card title is also just going to have some breathing room at the bottom. So margin bottom is going to be set to 20 pixels. And the next thing we want to do is move on to the card info. So let's do card info. And this is going to have display flex. So now you can see those are now left and right of each other. And before we move on and add the rest of the card info, I'm just going to go ahead and style the card price. And what we're going to do here is we're going to first set margin left to auto. What's cool about this is by doing this, because we're using flex, it's just going to move this item all the way over to the right. So it's kind of like a way to handle floats. So if you save that, you'll see that that has now moved all the way over to the right. Now we want this to kind of look like a button. So what we're going to do is add some padding here of 5 pixels and 20 pixels with a background color as well. So if we save that, you can now see that background color, but the edges are still squared off. So what we can do is use border radius to round those off. So we'll just do 20 pixels. So those are nice and round. All right, so now what we want to do is come back to, I'm actually going to unselect this main grid so it's a little easier to see. We'll come back into the card info, and I'm going to do align self to end. And that's just going to ensure that once, if this gets taller, that this is going to be always at the bottom of this display grid. The next thing we want to do is center this 30 minutes on this free button. Now, right now, it might not look like it's too far off from center, but we can make sure that it is centered by doing align items and then setting that to center. And now you can see that 30 minutes is now centered nicely on this free card price button. All right, so now what we want to do is, now that our design it looks right, let's go ahead and add that hover effect over on our card. So let's come back and scroll up, and we'll target the card and then hover. And this is going to be just a really simple transform on the translate Y of just -7, so it's going to move it up 7 pixels. And because we added that transition here of 0.3 ease, it's going to be a nice smooth motion once we hover over that. All right, so now we have pretty much the design done. It's just not responsive. I mean, it's responsive in the sense of, it resizes, but we want to change how much space it takes up based off the size of the screen. So what we want to do is we want to come down here and start writing some media queries. And to write a media query, we do @media. We want this to be based off of the screen, and it's going to initialize once max width hits 1,000 pixels. And we want to change something here. And what we want to change is the card. And what do we want to change in the card? We want to change how much space it takes up. So we'll do grid column in, which is how we defined it in up here. So we said grid column in span 4. Now we want it to take up half the space. And this is a 12 column layout. So we'll do span 6 to take up half the space. Now, once we resize this, you'll see it jumps up to this size. All right, so now we still have a couple more media queries to write here. And the next one we want is going to happen at 700 pixels. So we'll do 700. And we want to change grid column end here to do span 12. So it's going to span the full width. So let's go ahead and save that. If we resize this, you can see that has moved down. Now you'll see, like, once we move over, that this starts to break, and the reason it's breaking is up here it's still basing everything off of this size, and essentially, you know, auto gets smaller and smaller and smaller, but 40 pixels is consistent. So this 40 pixels is still calculated in the overall width. So what we can do to fix this issue is to just make the grid gap smaller. So let's come up here and right in the main, we can just make grid gap 20 pixels. So now that looks a lot nicer, but we're still going to have an issue here where it starts to become another problem. And we're going to fix that with another media query. So let's write a media query here. And this one's going to target at 500 pixels, and it's going to change a couple more things. And the first thing we want to do is we want to change the grid template column. So I'm going to come into grid template columns and just change out our entire column. So it's not going to be 12 anymore. I'm going to force 10 pixels on the left. I'm going to do repeat, but this time it's going to do 6 columns, and I'm going to use the 1FR. So they're going to be calculated equal size columns, and then on the right I'm going to have 10 pixels as well. And then grid gap, I'm going to drop this to 10 as well. And I'm also going to resize the cards grid. So come into cards, do grid column. Again, we want this to skip this first column, so it's going to start on 2. And because this is now 6 columns here, we want it to span 6. And then we want to also change the columns here. So grid template columns, repeat 6 columns that are equal sizes. And last, we want to change the grid gap here to 20 pixels. And on here, we want this because the max width is going to be 6. We don't need it to span 12 because that doesn't exist. It needs to span 6. All right, so now that we save that, let's go ahead and just check this out. And it looks like something isn't coming through correctly. So let me just take one more look here at this code and make sure I have this written right. And on further investigation, I have this set to grid column end. It needs to be grid column, which is the shorthand method. We want it to start on 2, which is grid column start, and grid column end is going to be span 6. So once we change that and save it, you can see that our design, it actually looks correct now. So on really small screens, we have 10 pixels on the left and right, and it takes the remaining 6 columns of space. And once we make this bigger, you can see the card gets bigger. Now let's go ahead and just duplicate this a couple times. So I'm just going to come in here into the card here and just duplicate this like 8 times. Now this isn't what I'm doing, and like I'm not hard coding this on my personal site. I'm using React, and I'm using some more programming and Gatsby and Contentful to get all this to pull in. But just for the sake of showing you how this works on the responsiveness, let's go ahead and just resize this. You can see how everything nicely resized, even on really, really tiny screens. And there you go. Now you've designed your own card layout using CSS Grid. If you liked this video and found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And be sure to check out our other design and coding tutorials on skillthrive.com and on our YouTube channel. Again, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive, and I'll see you in the next one.